They think a fence is a suggestion. They believe a property line is a debate. I'm about to teach them that some lines are absolute, and crossing them carries a consequence they can feel in their bones. That's what my grandpa said, sitting there on his porch in the pre-dawn gloom. He wasn't enjoying his retirement. He was a sentinel at his post, a guardian watching over his small patch of sovereign land. His coffee steamed in the cool air, but his eyes were like ice. He was watching the street, waiting. He knew he was coming. In our neighborhood, you didn't have to wonder if you were being watched. You just had to wonder when Doyle Mason would make his next pass. Our neighborhood was cursed with Doyle Mason. He wasn't some harmless busybody. He was a predator who fed on control, a self-appointed HOA enforcer who prowled our streets like a tin-pot dictator. He was maybe 50, with a sour, pinched face, and the kind of dead eyes that told you he enjoyed other people's misery. His weapon of choice wasn't a gun, but a clipboard and a smartphone, which he used to document his imaginary list of crimes. A garbage can left out an hour too long, a garden gnome he deemed tacky, grass that failed to meet his personal millimeter-precise standards. No one voted for him. No one hired him. He just crowned himself the neighborhood's judge, jury, and HOA executioner, and the board, led by a venomously sweet woman named Linda Clay, was more than happy to let him run wild. For months, he'd been a storm cloud on the horizon, a problem for other people. We'd see him, a malevolent shadow in a golf shirt, peering over Mrs. Gable's fence to photograph her bird bath, or arguing with the Davidsons because their son's basketball hoop was, in his words, a visual blight. But then he turned his attention to us. It started with Grandpa's tomato plants, a row of beautiful heirloom beefsteaks that Grandpa had cultivated for years. To Doyle, they were a violation of community aesthetics. He left a notice, a passive-aggressive little slip of paper tucked into our mailbox. Grandpa read it, crumpled it up, and threw it in the trash. That was Doyle's first mistake. He thought he was dealing with just another retiree he could bully into submission. He had no idea he'd just declared war on a man who wrote the manual on strategic defense. The conflict detonated a week later, with the groan of our backyard fence at 0530 hours. I was zombie walking through the kitchen when Grandpa, already planted in his rocker on the porch, growled, "He's back." I looked out the window, and there he was. Doyle, in the flesh, physically scaling our 6-foot privacy fence like a common thief. He had his phone out, the screen glowing in the dim light, snapping pictures of the offending tomato plants as if they were evidence in a murder trial. The sheer arrogance was breathtaking. He wasn't just enforcing a rule, he was violating state law. He was trespassing on posted private property, and he was doing it with the smug confidence of a man who believes he is untouchable. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to charge out there, to grab him by his collared shirt and throw him back over the fence myself. But Grandpa simply held up a hand, a silent, absolute command. "Patience," he ordered, his voice a low rumble. "Give a fool enough rope and he'll hang himself with it." That was his code. Precise, cold, the absolute opposite of Doyle's frantic obsession. The stakes were clear now. This was about more than tomatoes. It was about one man's absolute right to be secure on his own land versus a petty tyrant's delusion of power. Doyle Mason was about to get a lesson in jurisdiction, state law, and applied physics. He started this war. Grandpa was just going to end it with military precision. To understand what was about to happen, you have to understand my grandfather. When the HOA and Doyle Mason looked at him, they saw an old man, a relic from another time, who grew his own vegetables. They had no idea they were poking a man who once electrified the entire perimeter of a forward operating base in Afghanistan, with less equipment and more enemy fire than Doyle could ever imagine. Grandpa wasn't just a veteran, He was a retired master sergeant from the Army Corps of Engineers, specifically the 249th Engineer Battalion, Prime Power. His entire career, spanning 3 decades and multiple conflict zones, was dedicated to designing, installing, and securing power grids in the most hostile environments on Earth. He understood infrastructure, regulations, and security on a level that made the HOA's pathetic little book of bylaws look like a child's coloring book. His workshop wasn't filled with the rusty tools of a weekend hobbyist. It was a climate-controlled lab of precision instruments, calibration devices, and soldering stations, all organized with military discipline. On the wall, half hidden behind a blueprint for a municipal substation, was a framed certificate from the Department of the Army, commending him for exceptional service in hostile environment electrical engineering. He was a legend in the neighborhood, but not for his past. He was the pillar of the community, the quiet man everyone turned to when things went wrong. I remember after Hurricane Isabella rolled through a few years back, half the town was without power for a week. While the utility companies were struggling, Grandpa fired up his generator and ran extension cords to 3 of our neighbors' houses so they could keep their refrigerators and medical equipment running. He went from house to house, checking their breaker boxes, making sure everything was safe. Mr. Henderson, who lived across the street, told me once, "Your grandpa rewired my whole house after a lightning strike. The county inspector who came to sign off on it just walked through, shook his head, and said it was the cleanest, most over-spec work he'd ever seen. Said it was bomb-proof." That was Grandpa. He never used his skills to intimidate. He only ever used them to build and protect. But Doyle Mason and the HOA were about to force his hand, and they had no idea what kind of arsenal they were truly up against. The rot in our community started and ended with the HOA board, a 5-person tribunal led by its president, Linda Clay. Linda was a woman who weaponized pleasantness. She had a perfectly manicured lawn, a two-faced smile, and a core of pure, unadulterated malice. She wielded the HOA bylaws not to maintain community standards, but to settle personal scores and enrich her own network. Doyle Mason was her unofficial enforcer, her rabid dog on a leash she could deny ever holding. If Linda decided she didn't like the color of your front door, Doyle would suddenly find a dozen violations on your property, from the height of your hedges to the oil stain on your driveway. And the solution she always recommended? A list of approved vendors, at the top of which was a landscaping and contracting company owned by her brother-in-law. It wasn't a homeowners association. It was a protection racket. We saw them crush people. They hounded the Garcias, a young military family with weekly fines for their kids' playhouse, until they were forced to sell. They put a lien on the house of Mrs. Gable, an 80-year-old widow, over the state of her bird bath, nearly forcing her into foreclosure. They were bullies, plain and simple, hiding behind the veneer of rules and regulations. When Grandpa received the first notice about his tomato plants, he did what any reasonable person would do. He wrote a formal, polite letter to the board, citing his right to grow food on his property and respectfully requesting they call off their enforcer. The letter was ignored. After the first time Doyle climbed his fence, Grandpa filed a formal complaint, citing the specific time of the trespass and the relevant state statute. At the next HOA board meeting, which we attended, Linda Clay addressed the complaint with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Oh, Bill," she said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "We all know Doyle is just very passionate about maintaining our property values. I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding." Her eyes were cold, daring him to challenge her. They laughed at him. They shredded his formal, by-the-book complaint right in front of everyone. That was the moment the war changed. The harassment escalated. Doyle now felt completely untouchable. He would park his car across the street and just sit there, for hours, watching our house. He'd walk the property line, deliberately stepping just over it, taunting us. He left a dead squirrel on our porch, a sick, unspoken threat. We called the sheriff's department. A deputy came out, listened patiently, and then gave us the speech that every victim of HOA tyranny has heard. He explained the gray area of civil disputes, how HOAs have their own internal governance, and how, unless we could provide undeniable proof of a crime being committed in that exact moment, it was just our word against theirs. The system designed to protect us had failed. It had left us on our own. As the deputy drove away, Grandpa just stood on the porch, nodding slowly. He wasn't angry. He was calculating. The law wouldn't help, so he would have to use the law himself. Grandpa didn't descend into a rage. He ascended into his element. He went into his study, a room that was more like a command center, and for 3 days, he barely came out. He didn't rant or rave. He worked. He pulled up the county's Geographic Information System, or GIS, printing out a satellite map of our property with the surveyor's marks highlighted down to the centimeter. He downloaded a digital copy of our property's original deed from the county clerk's office, tracing its legal description and covenants back 50 years. He was building a fortress of legal fact, brick by undeniable brick. He opened a dozen tabs on his computer, cross-referencing our HOA's pathetic bylaws with the supreme authority of North Carolina state law. He operated with the calm, methodical precision of an intelligence analyst searching for a single vulnerability in an enemy's defense. And he found it. It was beautiful in its simplicity. North Carolina General Statute Section 14-159.13, the criminal trespassing law, was absolute. It superseded any HOA bylaw, but the key was proving the trespass. That's when his gaze shifted from legal databases to technical manuals. He began researching, not just as a homeowner, but as a prime power engineer. He downloaded the complete National Electrical Code, or NEC, the Bible of his profession. He zeroed in on Article 426, which covered fixed outdoor de-icing and snow-melting equipment, and Article 725 for low-voltage power circuits. He was looking for the precise intersection of law and physics. He found it in the regulations governing agricultural and security fencing. A low-voltage electric fence was perfectly legal for security purposes on private property, provided it met 2 strict conditions. The voltage had to be less than 10 volts be pulsed and non-lethal, and there had to be clear, unambiguous warning signs posted at regular intervals. The plan was born. He spent an entire afternoon drafting a schematic, a work of art that looked more like a military defense plan than a home improvement project. He specified the exact model of pulse charger, the gauge of the wire, the depth of the grounding rods, and the precise placement of the warning signs. Then he went online to the county planning department's website and, for a fee of $50, filed for a miscellaneous electrical permit, uploading his schematic and a description of the project. He was building his trap, and he was getting the government's permission to do it. While he waited for the permit to be approved, he ordered the parts. But he also ordered something else: 4 high-definition, weatherproof security cameras with night vision and motion-activated recording. He spent a day installing them, creating a complete, overlapping field of view covering every inch of our property line. He wasn't just building a fence, he was creating a kill box of evidence. The digital permit arrived in his email 2 days later. The trap wasn't just the wire he was about to string along the gate. It was the mountain of paperwork, the digital permit stamps, and the terabytes of video evidence behind it. Doyle was walking toward a shock, but the HOA was walking blindly into a legal apocalypse. With the permit approved and the cameras recording, Grandpa got to work. He installed the system with the precision of a surgeon. The insulators were perfectly spaced. The wires were taut. The grounding rod was driven 8 feet into the damp Carolina soil. And then came the final touch. A bright, industrial yellow sign, bolted directly to the center of our wrought iron gate. In bold black block letters, it read, "Warning, electric security fence. Trespassers will be shocked and prosecuted. NC Gen Stat, Section 14-159.13. It was a declaration. It was a dare. We didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, just before dawn, Doyle came prowling. Grandpa was on the porch, a silent sentinel in his rocking chair, sipping his black coffee. I was crouched by the living room window, my heart pounding. Doyle didn't even seem to notice the new sign. His arrogance was a shield that made him blind. He scaled the side fence as usual, his boots crunching on the gravel, muttering to himself about the flagrant disregard for aesthetics. He approached the gate, his hand reaching for the latch. The second his fingers made contact, snap! It was a sound I'll never forget, a sharp, angry crack of electricity. A jolt of pure consequence shot through Doyle's body. He screamed, a high-pitched yelp like a startled dog, and stumbled backward, his arms flailing. He landed hard in the dirt, scrambled to his feet in a panic, and fled down the street with a pronounced limp, clutching his hand. Grandpa didn't move an inch. He just took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. "That," he said, his voice a low rumble, "was the sound of accountability." The news of Doyle's shocking encounter spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By noon, an emergency HOA meeting was called. I went with Grandpa, expecting a firestorm. It was worse. It was a kangaroo court. Linda Clay sat at the head of the table, radiating false sympathy, and next to her sat Doyle, his arm now in a ridiculous theatrical sling, playing the part of the wounded victim. He pointed a trembling finger at Grandpa. "This man," he declared, his voice cracking with manufactured outrage, "is a danger to this community. He has deployed an electrified weapon. That gate is a death trap. It could have killed me." The room was silent, the other board members looking at Grandpa like he was a monster. Grandpa let the silence hang in the air, let their accusations curdle. Then he slowly leaned forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself. He simply slid a single, laminated piece of paper across the polished table. It slid to a stop directly in front of Linda Clay. "That, Mrs. Clay," he said, his voice as cold and hard as granite, "is my permit, issued and authorized by the county under the state electrical code. Fully inspected, fully legal, clearly signed." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And the required warning sign, which Mr. Mason apparently chose to ignore, is posted in accordance with the law." Linda stared at the permit as if it were a snake. She fumbled, her composure cracking. "Legal or not, it's hostile. It violates the spirit of our community. The HOA reserves the right to regulate." Grandpa cut her off, and this time there was no deference in his voice. It was pure iron. "Regulate? Absolutely. Trespass? Never. The North Carolina trespassing statute is not a suggestion. It's the law. Entering posted private property without consent is a crime. Your unlicensed agent, Mr. Mason, has committed that crime 3 times on my land, all of which is documented. I'm finished with warnings." He leaned back, his eyes sweeping across the entire board. This was the last warning. The next time he sets foot on my property, this will not be an HOA matter. It will be a criminal one. You could feel the power in the room shift. Doyle lost the battle in the yard. In that meeting, he lost the war for public opinion. But Grandpa wasn't done. The goal wasn't just to win, it was to annihilate. Doyle did not handle public humiliation well. Defeated in the meeting and stripped of his victim status, he went feral. For 2 straight days, he stalked our block in his rust bucket pickup truck, a predator circling its prey. He'd slow to a crawl in front of our driveway, his eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and obsession, as if waiting for a sign of weakness. Grandpa paid him no mind. He maintained his post on the porch, a thermos of coffee at his side, his gaze unwavering. He knew Doyle's ego was a fragile, cracked thing, and he had shattered it. It was only a matter of time before that rage boiled over into stupidity. Grandpa was a master strategist, and he knew his enemy. He knew Doyle couldn't let it go. On the third night, Doyle's obsession finally consumed him. Just after midnight, a scraping sound from the front gate jolted me awake. I crept to my window and peered into the darkness. And there he was, a shadowy figure, flashlight in one hand, a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters in the other. He was mumbling curses under his breath, a litany of pure venom directed at Grandpa. He was actually going to destroy the gate. He was escalating from trespassing to felony destruction of property. But he didn't know he was walking into the final, decisive phase of the operation. Grandpa was already there, waiting in the deep shadows of the porch, perfectly still. He held up a small black remote. "Watch this, kid," he whispered, his eyes locked on the target. The moment Doyle's bolt cutters bit into the steel of the gate, Grandpa pressed the button on the remote. ZIP! The distinct hum of the circuit surged, but this time it was different. Grandpa had modified the output. It wasn't just a sharp jolt. It was a sustained, muscle-locking current. Doyle's entire body convulsed as if he'd grabbed a live power line. He shrieked, a raw, guttural scream of pain and surprise. The bolt cutters flew from his hands as his muscles contracted violently, and he crashed backward into the mud, twitching. The whole time, a small red light glowed on the camera mounted under the eaves, capturing every single frame in crystal-clear 1080p. Grandpa calmly took a sip of his coffee. "Trespassing and destruction of property," he narrated quietly, as if dictating a report. Then he raised his phone, which was already recording a backup video. Every spasm, every curse, every pathetic scramble in the mud was now documented from two separate angles. But Doyle, in a final desperate act of self-destruction, did exactly what Grandpa had predicted he would. He pulled out his own phone and dialed 911. "Attempted murder!" he screamed into the phone, his voice a hysterical shriek. "This psycho is trying to execute me with an illegal electric fence. Send everyone!" 5 minutes later, the street was bathed in the blinding strobe of red and blue lights. 2 sheriff's cruisers screeched to a halt. Officers spilled out, hands on their holsters, their faces grim. They saw a chaotic scene. Doyle, covered in mud, trembling and pointing a shaking finger, and Grandpa, sitting calmly on his porch as if he were merely watching a late-night movie. "Sir," the first officer said to Grandpa, his voice tense, "step out with your hands visible. Is that gate actively electrified?" Grandpa didn't even stand up. "Yes, officer," he replied, his voice perfectly even. "It is registered, permitted, clearly posted with multiple warnings, and currently being recorded. Here is the paperwork." He slid the laminated permit across the porch table. "And here," he said, holding up a tablet computer, "is the video evidence you'll need." He tapped the screen, and the video of Doyle's attack began to play. The officers watched, their expressions shifting from suspicion to disbelief. They saw the entire sequence: the approach in the dead of night, the bolt cutters, the attempt to cut the gate, the shock, the fall. They saw it all in full HD. One officer looked up from the screen, his face a mask of stone. He turned to Doyle. "So you admit to trespassing with the intent to destroy property?" Doyle sputtered. "No." It was an official HOA inspection. The other officer raised an eyebrow. An inspection? At midnight? With bolt cutters? The law was an iron cage, and Doyle had just locked himself inside it and thrown away the key. The officers didn't need to deliberate. They had a signed permit, clear video evidence of multiple felonies, and a live recording of a false 911 call. They cuffed Doyle right there, in the glow of the very gate he had tried to destroy. Doyle howled about conspiracies, about Grandpa being a public menace, but his words were just the pathetic noise of a defeated man. Neighbors had poured out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. And this time they weren't whispering. They were applauding. Doyle called the police to be his saviors. Instead, they became his judge, jury, and taxi service to the county jail. The aftermath was a complete and total rout. Doyle Mason sat in the back of that police cruiser, drenched and defeated, his pathetic reign of HOA tyranny shattered into a million pieces. News of his arrest for criminal trespassing, vandalism, attempted theft, and filing a false police report was the lead story on the local news website by morning, complete with his glorious mud-streaked mugshot. But Grandpa wasn't finished. The foot soldier had been captured. Now it was time to take down the general. Armed with the official police report and a petition signed by nearly every resident in the neighborhood demanding the board's resignation, Grandpa attended the emergency HOA meeting the following week. He didn't have to say a word. He just stood at the back of the packed community room while another resident read the police report aloud. Every sordid detail, every lie Doyle had told was laid bare. When the report mentioned that Doyle had confessed Linda Clay had encouraged his proactive enforcement, a wave of outrage swept through the room. Linda tried to deny it, but her face was pale, her composure gone. She was exposed, her corrupt little empire crumbling around her. A vote of no confidence was called, and she and her entire board were forced to resign in disgrace, right then and there. A few months later, we received a check in the mail. It was a settlement from the HOA's insurance carrier. Grandpa had filed a civil lawsuit for harassment and negligence, and they had settled immediately rather than face him in court. He endorsed the check and donated the entire amount to a local veterans charity. The community was restored. A new, fair board was elected. People started talking to each other again. The dark cloud of oppression that Doyle and Linda had cast over the neighborhood was gone. Doyle Mason eventually took a plea deal, receiving 2 years of probation and a court order to never set foot in our neighborhood again. His house went up for sale a month later. Sometimes, late at night, I see Grandpa out on the porch, just sitting in his rocker. The gate is still there, but the power is off. It doesn't need to be on anymore. Its purpose was served. He's at peace, the warrior at rest, because the war is over. Won not with anger but with strategy, law, and a deep understanding of the enemy. I asked him once if he felt bad about what happened to Doyle. He took a long sip of coffee and looked out at his tomato plants, which were now heavy with fruit. "Good fences don't make good neighbors," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Respect for the law does, and sometimes you need a fence to teach them the law."